So what are we going to do in the next 30 minutes? We heard a bit about, okay, what is the decarbonization pathway that, for example, Nicole spoke about at Mitsubishi Chemicals. We all know and are familiar, of course, with the terms scope 1, 2, 3. We heard as well scope 1 and 2 is largely tackled, let's say, or the tools are known. But the question is, what do we do with this pink part here? What do we do with scope 3? And of course, we know that a lot of companies, including your companies, made pledges according to the SBTi, made pledges to net zero, and made pledges to decarbonize. So really the question I want to tackle today is, what is the state currently of the market around the last bit to reduce the scope 3? And I'm very happy to actually have this spot, because we heard the decarbonization pathway of Mitsubishi, we heard about the digital product passports, and now let's look into, okay, how do we actually close this gap, or bridge the gap, as the title of the presentation said, to getting towards net zero. And I brought a picture of marbles, not just because I like them, but I will come back to that. Keep that in mind. But bit of structure, what are we going to do? First, who am I? Who's STX? Why am I standing here? Then we're going to go towards the state of global SBTi commitments. And then looking into, and there's a bit of a spoiler on the agenda, into what is the state of carbon removals, how can you bridge the gap, what is the state of the market currently, and what is needed as next steps in order to go forward. And then to look into also how to get started, not only to mention the challenges, but also to mention what can we actually do about it. Start at the beginning. Who am I? What's STX? We are a trading house for environmental commodities. Okay, big word. What does it mean? Basically, we heard a lot about the products that we trade, also from Nicole before, regarding scope 1 and 2. This is, so to say, the classical business in which we're in. We are trading renewable electricity certificates, also PPAs. We are trading renewable gas, so biomethane. We are also with a subsidiary trading in the ETS. But I think those are things, we all, and I mean, so to say, the sustainability community talked about a lot in the last couple of years. I think by now, everybody kind of knows, okay, what are the different types of renewable electricity? Maybe there's a bit of gap in knowledge when it comes to what is happening within those markets. We can happily discuss that as well. But we are also heavily involved since actually the mid-2000s in carbon projects and increasingly in carbon removal projects. But that's why I want to give a bit of a glimpse what is happening in that space. A bit for me, if you read my title, there's Regional Lead Central Europe of Strive by STX. I think always the longer the title, sometimes the more bullshit is behind them. I hope that's not true for me. But basically it just means I'm responsible for DACH and Benelux markets within our corporate division, which is Strive. So not dealing with utilities, but with corporates. The end user in the end of all those decarbonization tools. So enough about me, enough about Strive, enough about STX. Looking at SBTi, this number of 3,406 companies committed to net zero by 2050, or targets to be validated within the next 2 years. That is 2 weeks old. I just looked it up because I know that this number is constantly rising, and now it's 90 more. So it's in the space of 2 weeks, 90 more companies handed in their targets for validation. And we see that globally, and I'm very thankful for Nicole's input regarding Europe is the early warning system. Globally, we see this also reflected, right? Europe is definitely the region with the most companies handing in SBTi targets. You see that Asia also makes up a big chunk, North America less, and then we get less and less and less when we go to Latam, to Oceania, to Africa. However, the overall number, the absolute of 3,400 is of course, or now 3,500 almost, is of course a lot. But what this also tells us is there is still a lot to come, so to say, right? We see that probably the targets validate. I've been told I need to stick behind this orange line. That's why normally I want to show. Maybe I do it. Up until 2025, we see that more than 3,400 companies will have validated targets by then. And this will most likely even rise further and further at the same rate, at least for the next couple of years. Which leads to the question, so what? Okay, cool. Many are doing targets, and many commit to carbon neutrality at least 2050. But how do they actually get there? Just thematically, we know, I talked about it, scope 1 and 2, or within the value chain, also scope 3. This is certainly topics that are being tackled, and this is certainly topics where, let's say, the tool set, at least for scope 1 and 2, is quite clear. For scope 3, I think it's clear what needs to be done, but it's still a huge challenge to actually get all this data and get all your suppliers on board. But in order to get net zero, then you want to also look beyond your supply chain in the downstream. I actually talked to Flo of Stora Enso before. I don't see her now. There. And she also said, yeah, the downstream is actually one heavy challenge that we have because we don't have so much control over it. If you're in the end delivering packaging to consumers or even to industrials, it's sometimes hard to control that, right? What happens with that afterwards? And that's certainly a topic for circular economy, which is not my topic of expertise, but the question is, how do I still get to net zero, even if there are those gaps? And the answer which SBTi gives is carbon removals in the end, for a certain percentage. But if you look at how big this absolute impact or how big this absolute demand might be of carbon removals when you actually want to reach that target, those targets, then there's a bit of a gap. And now you might get the hint of why I put a random slide of marbles on there. In the end, this dark blue part, we need to somehow cover it in the future, right? And therefore, yeah, it is critical to achieve net zero, to have CO2 removals. Yet the supply of carbon removals is way, way, way off what is actually needed currently. And what is needed to just go to those net zero efforts of the companies who actually put in their claims yet, or who will be validated within the next year. So another depiction of those marbles, this is what we have, this is what we need. At least that's what McKinsey says, in order to get to those 2050 targets. So now the marbles make sense, right? You have one marble, which is the current demand, but actually you need a lot more. So, short recap of the situation. The annual demand for removal credits is projected to grow remarkably. We see that the currently registered projects are falling short behind what will be actually needed and creating a gap. And therefore, it is needed to have investment in those projects in order to close this gap. And when I mostly talk with clients about those topics, or about this topic, they say, okay, 2 years ago, we managed to finally figure out how can we, for example, fulfill all the R100 criteria. How can we finally get there to buy renewable electricity globally? While this is, in comparison, let's say, a rather low-hanging fruit. At the moment, you go to the market, you need to figure out, okay, what kind of certificates, what kind of PPAs do I need to buy? Do this research task, basically, and then procure them. Okay, you can optimize the procurement, you can try to play around a bit with how those markets work, but in the end, it's comparatively straightforward, let's say, right? So they say, okay, why do you come now with carbon removals? Because we just managed to get a glimpse of, okay, how can we actually challenge or tackle this challenge of scope 1 and 2? And now we should go to scope 3. The target is in 2050. That's a long time in the future. why now, so to say? Yeah, I mean, if you look at the types of carbon removals, and this will not be news for the people here in this room, I think, but it is sometimes news for people that I speak with, which maybe should be more informed about them because their companies actually have a 2050 target. You have those three different types of removals, right? And we can dive deeper into it. What is the different types of removals and why should you go for which type? We can do that gladly in the breakout session. And I think also, we will have input, for example, from Laura Ann regarding that. So let's leave that for the breakout session because we only have 30 minutes. But the question is, okay, how do I tackle this? How do I actually manage to get investment into those? And how do I not fall into the trap of saying, okay, our sustainability department choose this removal project. This fulfills all our criteria. This is perfect. And then, I don't know, a couple of years later, not the sufficient amount of credits is there. There is a risk of actually receiving the delivery that you need in order to reach those targets. There's a risk of maybe also not doing the full due diligence. I mean, we saw that with the avoidance credits year after year after year. There are scandals about it, basically, and double counting cases and whatnot. You really want to prevent that, right? So we are looking into this, basically, and seeing, okay, how can you procure those projects? In the end, as with almost everything, you can buy them on the spot when you need them. You can do a forward transaction so that you already cover your need for the next years to a fixed price, and you can do an investment in an own project. Then the question is, do you go for one specific project where you have those risks, or do you actually set your criteria and say, in the lines of those criteria, we want to build a portfolio, or we want to purchase from a portfolio so that our targets are being met and that we have a sufficient due diligence behind it. We know that those criteria are fulfilled. And let's look at an example. That's basically what we are, to be honest, start doing since 1-2 years, because as said, carbon removals is, so to say, the next topic in line which clients are facing. And in the end, when you look at it, you want to follow criteria, you want to follow standards. That's, by the way, the big elephant in the room when you speak about carbon removals. There is no global standard, so to say. There is SBTi, who says, okay, there are certain criteria to it, and you should procure your carbon removals according to those criteria. But besides that, there's no detailed guideline behind it. There are a lot of principles, for example, the Oxford principle in this example, which is basically saying, okay, gradually shift from avoidance to removal over the years when it's needed. But the big elephant in the room is, okay, which direct credits do I need to buy in the end? And this is also why I showed you this matrix, because in the end, when you go for one project or for 10 projects, doesn't really matter. But if you choose specific projects and say, okay, those fulfill the criteria that we now have, you have not a lot of flexibility to actually change maybe according to standards that are currently evolving. And that's why I emphasize so much on, okay, how can you buy them and why does it make sense to go into a portfolio? So in this example, for instance, we looked at 10-year supply of those credits. We fixed, okay, what are the criteria? Then us as trading house, we also have own projects, but mainly we act as a trader. We gather those from our books and say, okay, we deliver them within the certain years. We set the criteria, we set the share of how much avoidance, how much removal in each year. And then for this package, basically, you have a fixed price and you know already what it will cost you. And going back towards what is this gap and how do we jump over the gap or how do we bridge this gap, this, of course, leads to the fact that we can supply investment and we can supply financing into those projects, which is needed in order to go from one marble to the bigger jar. And in the end, yes, this is a very salesy slide, but what I want to say mainly of it is, doesn't matter if you do that with STX or anyone else, what you really need to look for within those markets to avoid, let's say, the shitstorm of carbon avoidance before and the problems of going from one standard to the other and needing to jump between the single criteria, that you have a counterparty who actually does their own due diligence on the projects and doesn't rely on the project developer, and who also manages for you this risk of not being reliant on one counterparty, for example, on one project developer that might deliver but might be very dependent on the financing of this single project, and therefore when they cannot deliver, you have a problem. So you want a counterparty that bundles this together and that gives it to you, and that provides you also the insight of how those standards might evolve over the years. I was told, and as Laura Ann said as well, that the PDF is shared. Just if you want to have a look into what are the current standards, what do they say, you can just either scan the QR code now. I see it is accepted, or you can do that from the PDF. And then, you have a guide towards, okay, what is it around carbon removals and how can you actually navigate through those single standards. The idea, so to say, is to say, let's start investing early in order to meet the targets of tomorrow. Why am I saying this? As mentioned before, carbon removals are not often seen as the urgent next matter, but as shown with the different types of technology that are behind them, you see that there will be a run-up phase of those. If you have a nature-based solution, for example, it will not produce the full amount of credits from the first year, right? It will scale up over the years. And those run-up phases, depending on technology, can go from, let's say, 2-3 years when you have a technology-based air capture-based, for example, carbon removal. But they can go up until 7, 8, 9 years. And that's why at least it's valuable to start thinking about it early. And in the end, when you look at this, again, very salesy, but if you look at what are the factors of risk mitigation, of basic benefits, and of the value added, this is really a guide to go through, I think, as a sustainability department and see, okay, those are the points we need to keep in mind. So this can really be taken as, so to say, the pathway to, okay, what kind of projects do I want? What counterparty do I want to procure them with? And in the end, as said, what you want to have there is somebody that basically mitigates the risk from you. But when you look at the overall market, then I wanted to show you also a bit of the numbers behind it and a bit of the current pricing. So if you look into it, then you see in the darker shade, you see the nature-based solution. In the more bright shade, you see the technology and hybrid solutions. And you see the expected price levels that we see over time. And what you there see as well is that, so to say, the gap between the cheapest and the most expensive projects is expected to, let's say, close further. But you also see that there's, purely from a market-based perspective, the opportunity to maybe invest in projects now, invest in certain types of projects, which might become more expensive over time because the demand will rise. And I think when we heard about all the abbreviations before, we will see more focus on the removal market and therefore also more demand flooding towards it. And therefore you want to start looking into those different solutions. And I'm more than happy to invite you to the roundtable later to get into the discussion further. But this just as a first input. Thank you.